Hi, I'm Margie Levine, Assistant Counsel with the Ethics Law and Policy Branch at the Office of Government Ethics. This is part one of a two-part training on the seeking and negotiating employment rules, which are in subpart F of the Standards of Ethical Conduct. And subpart F starts at 5 CFR 2635-601 for those of you who would like to pull up the regulation during this training. This training is geared toward newer ethics officials, as well as any ethics officials needing or wanting a refresher on subpart F. Before jumping into the training, it's important to consider why subpart F matters and what ethics concerns subpart F is addressing. It's addressing the concern that federal employees who are looking for other jobs or positions outside the federal government might favor someone with whom they're seeking employment in the work they do for the government, and that would undermine the public's trust in the integrity of government services. And unfortunately, there are several real-life examples of employees favoring prospective employers in their government work and facing serious consequences as a result. An example you may be familiar with is the case involving Darlene Druin, who was at one point the Air Force's second highest procurement official, and she favored Boeing in agency contract matters while at the same time negotiating for employment with Boeing. Her actions violated not only subpart F, but also the criminal conflict of interest statute, 18 U.S.C. 208. And she ultimately had to serve jail time and pay a fine, among other things, as a result of this criminal violation. And you'll find other examples of similar violations involving negotiating employment in OGE's annual prosecution surveys, which are available on OGE's website. Next slide. In this training, I will provide you with an overview of the subpart F requirements and the key terms and issues that arise when applying subpart F. And we'll also talk more about the significance of subpart F and specifically how it can serve as a fence that prevents executive branch employees from violating the criminal conflict of interest statute. And finally, we'll highlight the importance of you as ethics officials in training and advising employees as early and as often as possible on the subpart F requirements, and particularly training them on when they should come to you for advice to determine whether they have any ethics obligations as a result of their job search. Next slide. We'll start with a visual representation of what subpart F is and where it came from. You can also find a written overview of subpart F in section 2635-601. OGE issued subpart F as a result of Executive Order 12674, which was issued by the first President Bush. And that executive order established the 14 principles of ethical conduct that you find at the beginning of the Standards of Conduct, including one principle about seeking employment, which says employees shall not engage in outside employment or activities, including seeking or negotiating for employment, that conflict with official government duties and responsibilities. And that executive order authorized and required OGE to implement rules about each of the principles of ethical conduct, which led to OGE issuing subpart F, among other sections in the Standards of Conduct. And what is subpart F? It has two main components. First, it's a recusal requirement that is largely based on the recusal requirement in 18 U.S.C. 208, the criminal conflict of interest statute, and specifically the part of 208 regarding negotiating for employment. But the subpart F recusal requirement is also based on impartiality concerns regarding job search actions that fall short of negotiating for employment, also known in subpart F as seeking employment. The second component of subpart F is the notification requirements for public filers regarding negotiations or agreements for post-government employment or compensation. And those notification requirements come from the Stock Act. And we'll talk about the Stock Act requirements in part 2 of this presentation. Next slide. So what is the main recusal requirement under subpart F? Under subpart F, an employee who is seeking employment with a non-federal entity must recuse from particular matters that, to the employee's knowledge, affect the financial interests of the prospective employer. Next slide. It's important to note that this recusal requirement does not restrict employees from job searching. Executive branch employees can look for and pursue whatever job opportunities they want to pursue, whether it's something in the private sector or another federal job. But what subpart F is restricting is what employees can work on in their government position when they're seeking employment with a non-federal employer whose financial interests are affected by the employee's government work. So if the employee is only looking for other federal jobs, then this recusal does not apply. And if the non-federal prospective employer's financial interests will not be affected by the matters the employee works on for the government, then again, the employee does not have this recusal requirement. You, as ethics officials, are really in the best position to address this threshold question of whether the non-federal prospective employer's financial interests are affected by the employee's government duties, and whether the employee meets the other factors that trigger the recusal, which we'll talk about soon. And so I would encourage you in your training and advice to employees on subpart F to emphasize that they should really come to you as early as possible in their job search process and make sure they know how to contact you, that they have your contact info. And recommend that they contact you as soon as they start getting in touch with prospective employers, but ideally even earlier than that when they're considering a job search, so that you can advise them on whether they'll have this recusal requirement. Employees are not required by subpart F to tell their supervisor that they're seeking employment or that they have a recusal because of a job search. That said, subpart F does require that if an employee becomes aware of the need to recuse, that they must take whatever steps are necessary to carry out the recusal. And practically speaking, that might include letting their coworkers or supervisor know about their recusal. But technically, they're not required by subpart F to contact their supervisor. They should, however, come to you, their ethics officials, so that you can help them determine whether they meet the factors that trigger the subpart F recusal. And besides this threshold question of whether the prospective employer's financial interests would be affected by the employee's government work, the other important question you would be advising the employees on is to determine whether they're seeking employment. And we're about to talk about what seeking employment means. Next slide. But first, I want to note that the word employment is also defined in subpart F, and not every outside opportunity that the employee pursues will meet this definition of employment. Employment is defined in subpart F, and you can see the elements of that definition on this slide, as any form of non-federal employment or business relationship involving the provision of personal services by the employee, whether to be undertaken at the same time as or subsequent to federal employment. It includes, but is not limited to, personal services as an officer, director, employee, agent, attorney, consultant, contractor, general partner, or a trustee. You might have noticed that compensation isn't mentioned in this definition of employment. So, service on a board of directors, whether compensated or not, would meet this employment definition for purposes of the subpart F recusal. That said, it's been OG's long-standing position that providing certain uncompensated volunteer services, like volunteering at a soup kitchen, is not considered employment under subpart F. And you'll find in subpart F an example below the definition of employment confirming this view that certain volunteer work is not considered employment. What is sometimes overlooked about this definition of employment is the language at the bottom of this slide, undertaken at the same time as or subsequent to federal employment. So employment is not only the typical job search situation, like where the employee is looking to leave their government position for a position elsewhere. It also includes a position or job the employee would take while they're still working for the government. We talked about board service, so that's one example. Or let's say the employee wants to teach an evening class or look for clients for an outside business that they have while still working for the government. These outside positions would be covered by this subpart F definition of employment. I think when it comes to outside activities and positions that the employee would hold during their government employment, understandably, ethics officials focus on the applicable outside activity rules, like in subpart H of the Standards of Conduct, which include the rules about teaching, speaking, and writing. And maybe your agency has a supplemental regulation that includes a prior approval requirement for outside activities. So subpart F and the question of whether the seeking employment recusal is triggered by an employee considering an outside position may get lost in the mix of other applicable ethics rules. And there may also be a tendency to think of subpart F as only applying to job searches for post-government employment. But as we see here, the employment definition is broader than that and will apply to some outside activities or positions. So if you think you might be overlooking subpart F when you get an outside activity question, please add this consideration of whether the employee has any subpart F recusal obligations to your checklist when receiving outside activity questions. Next slide. The subpart F recusal requirement, as we said, is triggered when the employee starts seeking employment with a non-federal entity. So a key question for ethics officials and employees is, what is seeking employment and when does it start? And according to the definition section 603B of subpart F, an employee is seeking employment when the employee makes an unsolicited communication to a prospective employer or the prospective employer's agent or intermediary regarding possible employment with that employer, unless the employee is only requesting a job application, or seeking employment starts when the prospective employer or prospective employer's agent or intermediary makes an unsolicited communication to the employee regarding possible employment, and the employee makes a response other than rejection. So you need this unsolicited communication by either the employee or the prospective employer, or by an intermediary of the employee or prospective employer in order to be seeking employment. Regarding intermediaries, if, let's say, the employee is using a headhunter or other employment search firm to help them find a job, the employee is seeking employment with a non-federal entity only if the intermediary identifies for the employee the companies that they've contacted on the employee's behalf. So if the headhunter hasn't told the employee the names of the companies it's contacted, the employee is not seeking employment with those companies and doesn't have a recusal requirement. Next slide. Although technology has certainly advanced over the years, and as a result, the ways in which people look for jobs has changed over the years, the application of subpart F is the same, regardless of the technology used. So, in number 1 on this slide, posting your resume or listing your professional information or having a professional profile on a website or social media site like LinkedIn is not seeking employment because your profile isn't targeting any one prospective employer. It's not an unsolicited communication with a particular prospective employer. And please note that I'm not endorsing LinkedIn. I'm just mentioning it as an example of one of those professionally focused social media sites. In number 2 on this slide, let's say after posting your online professional profile, you receive notification that somebody in particular, a company, viewed your profile. In that situation, you're not seeking employment, even if you're told the identity of the company, because it's not an unsolicited communication from you or from the company. And in number 3 on this slide, what if you receive a message from a company via LinkedIn or some other site asking if you're interested in a new job? If you don't make a response to the message, you're not seeking employment. But if you respond with anything other than clear rejection, you are seeking employment. And I'll come back to what clear rejection looks like. In 2016, OGE made some modifications and updates to subpart F, in part to modernize the regulation to reflect these more current job search situations online. And to be clear, these modernization updates didn't change the recusal requirement in subpart F. They just added and revised examples in subpart F to show how the seeking employment definition applies to online social media job searches. So if you review the examples that are right below the seeking employment definition in subpart F, you'll find all of the scenarios summarized in this slide reflected in those examples. Next slide. Now, in some situations, the employee's subpart F recusal requirement will continue, such as when the seeking employment evolves into negotiating for employment and then results in a job offer and an actual agreement for employment. But subpart F also tells us when the employee is no longer seeking employment, such that the recusal requirement ends. And seeking employment and the related recusal ends when the employee or prospective employer rejects the possibility of employment and all discussions have ceased, or 2 months go by after the employee submits their resume and they don't receive a response from the prospective employer showing interest. Regarding rejecting the possibility of employment, OGE has recommended in the past and continues to recommend that ethics officials give employees multiple examples of ways that they can respond to prospective employers that will effectively reject the possibility of employment for purposes of subpart F, such that it's clear the employee doesn't have to recuse for matters affecting the outside entity. And you'll find examples of rejection language in subpart F and in a related legal advisory, DO 04029. And here are a couple of those examples. I will remember your interest if I ever decide to leave government. All my time and attention right now are devoted to my government job, and I'm not in a position to discuss employment. Or the employee could cite ethics considerations as a reason that they can't talk about employment until they leave government. Hopefully these examples help employees communicate with prospective employers in ways that they're comfortable with and in ways that help them comply with subpart F. But please note that a response that merely defers discussion of employment until the foreseeable future or until after the employee completes an assignment affecting the prospective employer, those responses would not constitute rejection. This is a good place to end part 1, since we just talked about when seeking employment ends and when the recusal would end. In part 2, we'll take a closer look at why the subpart F recusal requirement starts where it does at the seeking employment stage, and why it's so important that ethics officials encourage employees to come to them as early as possible in their job search. And we'll also talk about the Stock Act notification requirements. Thanks for watching part 1 of this training, and I hope you'll join me for part 2.